Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that shock, intrigue, and leave us questioning the world around us. In today's case, we bring you a chilling and twisted tale, one of betrayal, deception, and a deadly obsession. This is the story of Cooked and Eaten by Her Friends, a tale of jealousy, greed, and calculated violence. This case will leave you wondering, what lengths will someone go to when their perfect life is on the line? And how could someone so close, someone you trust, become capable of such unspeakable acts? Stay with us as we unravel the dark and tragic story of Cooked and Eaten by Her Friends. It all began with a dinner party, a seemingly normal gathering among friends, but one of them would not leave alive, and the others would commit an act so gruesome it defies comprehension. The shocking truth behind this horrific crime would remain buried for years, only to be uncovered in the most unexpected way. What happened when the innocent dinner turned into a macabre feast? What secrets were hidden behind the smiles and laughter? Prepare yourself for a story that will leave you speechless, questioning the limits of human depravity. This is not just a murder. It's a betrayal, a conspiracy, and a terrifying reflection of the darkness that can lie within us all. This is the story of the most horrific crime you could never imagine, a woman cooked and eaten by the very people she called friends. In the quiet town of Brooksville, where the streets seemed to always glimmer with a peaceful ambience, four friends were the epitome of harmony. They had grown up together, their bonds sealed by years of shared memories, laughter, and mutual respect. The town itself, small and tucked away from the bustle of city life, often gave off an air of tranquility. Yet, as idyllic as it seemed, there was an undercurrent to Brooksville that many were unaware of, an unseen tension that bubbled beneath the surface. Sarah, a woman in her early 30s, had always been the heart of the group. She had the kind of warmth that drew people in, an easy smile that could light up even the dullest room. Sarah was the one who organized most of the gatherings, the glue that kept the group from drifting apart as the years went by. She worked as an event planner, a career that allowed her to remain in constant contact with others. Sarah's reputation in town was that of a kind, reliable woman, one who made everyone feel welcome and at ease. Her friends Jack, Emma, and Lucas had each been in Sarah's life for as long as she could remember. Jack was a gifted chef, a man whose culinary talents were renowned in the town. He had an undeniable charm, a certain charisma that made him the center of attention wherever he went. But Jack's competitive nature often bordered on obsession. Though outwardly friendly, there was always something behind his eyes, a hunger to outshine everyone around him. That ambition sometimes clouded his judgment, turning even the simplest acts into matters of personal triumph. Emma, on the other hand, was more reserved. She had a quiet, almost introspective nature, and preferred to listen rather than speak. But beneath her calm exterior was a mind that, though thoughtful, harbored deep insecurities. Emma had always felt like an outsider in some ways, never fully able to measure up to the success or charisma of the others in the group. Her struggles with self-worth were a silent part of her life, known only to herself, and perhaps to Jack, who had a knack for reading people. Lucas, the final member of the group, was the charming one. He had a magnetic personality, someone everyone seemed to gravitate toward. His wit, confidence, and good looks made him well liked by all. But Lucas had his own demons. Beneath his polished exterior, he carried a sense of emptiness, a feeling that he was never quite fulfilled, no matter what he achieved. It was a void that he struggled to fill, and often sought out ways to gain validation, whether it was through his relationships, his appearance, or his social status. Lucas was the type of person who rarely revealed his true feelings, choosing instead to keep them buried beneath layers of charm and confidence. Despite their differences, the four friends had maintained a close-knit relationship. They had celebrated birthdays, holidays, and milestones together, their shared history creating an unspoken understanding between them. There was a level of trust among them, but like any group of friends, there were hidden dynamics, jealousies, rivalries, and secrets that none of them ever spoke about. It was on one of these ordinary nights that Sarah invited her friends over for dinner. She had just returned from a business trip and wanted to reconnect with them. The invitation was simple, a casual evening of good food and company, nothing out of the ordinary. Sarah's house, tucked away at the edge of town, was the perfect setting for such an evening. The interior was warm, inviting with a sense of comfort in every corner. The table was set with fine dishes, candles casting a soft glow across the room, and the scent of a freshly prepared meal wafting through the air. It was a picture of domestic bliss, a calm, serene setting where nothing seemed out of place. Jack, ever the culinary perfectionist, had prepared the meal himself. As the group sat down to eat, there was an air of contentment. The food was exquisite, rich with flavors that left an impression on everyone. Jack's talents were evident, but it was clear that he had gone above and beyond for this dinner, perhaps too much so. His obsession with culinary excellence had always been a defining characteristic, but tonight it seemed to border on an unsettling perfectionism. There was something almost ritualistic in the way he served the dishes, each course presented with an air of reverence. It wasn't just about the food, it was about something more, something deeper. As the night wore on, the conversation flowed easily. There were laughs, shared memories, and the occasional playful jabs, the kind of easy banter that only close friends can share. But there was an undertone to the evening that none of them fully recognized at the time. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it hung in the air like an invisible thread connecting them all. A feeling of unease, of something about to go wrong, lingered in the background, unnoticed by the group. Sarah, ever the gracious host, excused herself after dessert, telling her friends that she needed to rest after her long trip. The evening had been enjoyable, but she felt a sudden heaviness and inexplicable sense of fatigue. She smiled as she left the table, not knowing that the atmosphere in the room had shifted. Her friends, though still chatting, exchanged glances that were too quick to be caught by Sarah. Something had changed. The warmth of the evening was replaced by an unspoken tension, a strange shift that none of them could articulate. Later that night, after Sarah had gone to bed, the others lingered in the living room, nursing their drinks. It was at that moment, in the shadows of the house, that the plans they had been brewing came to fruition. No one knew the exact moment when it all began, but the night was no longer innocent. The bonds of friendship were about to be tested in ways that none of them could have predicted. What was supposed to be a dinner among friends had morphed into something far more sinister. The details of what happened next were lost in the haze of what followed, but the signs would be clear to investigators later on. The evening that had started as a celebration would end in horror. Sarah's absence the next morning would set off a chain of events that no one could have imagined. Her friends, though pretending to be concerned, knew exactly what had happened. The plan, carefully laid out over months, had been executed. In the coming days, the search for Sarah would turn up nothing. Her disappearance seemed inexplicable. There were no signs of forced entry into her home, no indication of a struggle. Sarah had simply vanished. Her family, friends, and the authorities were left scrambling for answers, each theory more unlikely than the last. It was a mystery that would soon unravel in the most horrifying way. The truth, however, would remain hidden for a time. As the search stretched on, the quiet town of Brooksville began to feel uneasy. Whispers filled the air, rumors of Sarah's fate circulating among the townsfolk. Yet no one suspected the darkness that had taken root within her circle of friends. The once perfect friendship had fractured, leaving only the terrifying remnants of a crime that no one could have seen coming. And so, as the days passed, the shadows that had begun to form in the corners of the group's bond would grow ever darker, waiting to be revealed. What had happened that night, behind the walls of Sarah's home, would soon be discovered. But the truth would come at a cost that none of them could have ever predicted. As the days passed following Sarah's disappearance, the small town of Brooksville was filled with a growing sense of unease. The disappearance of a well-known and well-liked woman like Sarah was deeply unsettling. Her absence left a void, both in her close-knit group of friends and in the community as a whole. People who had known Sarah for years, neighbors, colleagues, and the few close friends she had in the town began to wonder how such a disappearance could happen without any explanation. Sarah had always been a reliable, dependable presence in their lives. Her absence felt unnatural, almost as if the very fabric of the town had been disrupted. Despite the police's best efforts to piece together the clues, no one seemed to know what had happened. The search for Sarah had been exhaustive, combing through forests, local parks, and nearby areas, but no trace of her could be found. Her house remained undisturbed, as if she had simply vanished into thin air. There was no sign of forced entry, no signs of struggle, and no evidence that she had left on her own accord. The disappearance was bizarre, and as time passed, theories began to circulate among the townspeople, none of which seemed to explain what had truly happened to her. The police had questioned Sarah's friends and family, but no one had any answers. Jack, Emma, and Lucas seemed genuinely concerned about her disappearance, their worry matching that of Sarah's own family. The three of them spoke with detectives, recounting their interactions with Sarah in the days leading up to her vanishing. The more they spoke, the more confused the investigators became. Nothing about Sarah's behavior had suggested that she was in any danger. If anything, Sarah had been excited to catch up with her friends, eager to share her experiences from her business trip. Her sudden disappearance seemed utterly out of character. Days stretched into weeks, and the investigation showed no signs of progress. As time wore on, the small town of Brooksville began to settle into a grim routine. Sarah was missing, but the mystery of where she had gone remained unsolved. The question gnawed at everyone's mind: was she alive? Was she somewhere out there, hurt or hiding? Or had something far more sinister happened to her? The unanswered questions lingered, fueling rumors and speculation that only deepened the sense of unease in the community. Then, one evening, a breakthrough came in the form of an anonymous phone call to the police. The caller, who refused to reveal their identity, claimed to know what had happened to Sarah and where her body could be found. The tip was cryptic but specific enough that the police decided to act on it. The location provided was an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, an abandoned building that had been forgotten by most of the community. It was a place where no one ever ventured, a relic of a bygone era now left to decay. The police arrived at the scene with high hopes, though they had no idea what they would find when they entered the building. What they discovered inside the warehouse would change everything. It was a scene that seemed more like something from a horror movie than a real-life investigation. Amid the rusting remnants of machinery and broken wooden crates, they found the remnants of a human body. The remains were not fully intact, and the horror of what they saw was compounded by the state of the body. The flesh had been partially cooked. Some of it had been charred, others had been seasoned, as if prepared for consumption. It was clear that the body was not just a victim of violence but had been subjected to something far worse, something unspeakable. The signs of cannibalism were undeniable. Pieces of flesh had been removed and cooked, prepared with a method that suggested skill. This was not a crime of passion. It was cold, calculated, and planned. The discovery sent shockwaves through the police department as they struggled to process what they were seeing. The scene was horrific beyond belief, and the investigation quickly took a darker turn. It became evident that whoever had been responsible for Sarah's death had planned it carefully, with a level of preparation and intention that was both chilling and unsettling. At first, the police had no idea who could be behind such a heinous crime. The idea that Sarah's own friends Jack, Emma, and Lucas could be involved was inconceivable. They had all been part of her life for years. They had shared so many good times together, and their bond seemed unbreakable. How could these people, whom Sarah had trusted, be capable of such brutality? As the investigation progressed, the police began to uncover the horrifying details of what had happened. The forensic evidence gathered from the warehouse was crucial. It was clear from the remains that the body had not been consumed in a spontaneous act of violence. No, this had been part of a planned ritual. The meal had been meticulously prepared, and each piece of flesh had been carefully chosen. It became apparent that this crime had been committed not just for the act of murder, but for the act of consumption itself. And there was no denying that the perpetrators had been involved in a sickening, twisted form of cannibalism. As the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, investigators focused on Sarah's inner circle, her friends. Jack, Emma, and Lucas were questioned again, and this time the police began to dig deeper into their lives. What they uncovered would shock everyone, not just because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the psychological manipulation that had occurred behind the scenes. There had been a disturbing dynamic among the friends, one that no one had seen coming. It became clear that Jack had been the ringleader. His obsession with food and culinary perfection had crossed a dangerous line long before Sarah's death. Jack had always been passionate about cooking, but what started as an innocent interest had evolved into something far darker. He had become fixated on the idea of creating the ultimate meal, a dish so unique and profound that it would transcend anything that could be imagined in the culinary world. But what Jack didn't realize, or perhaps didn't care to acknowledge, was that his pursuit of perfection had begun to take on the qualities of an obsession. His need for control, his desire to push boundaries, and his hunger for recognition had clouded his judgment, ultimately leading him down a path from which there was no return. It was in this state of obsession that Jack had proposed the unthinkable to Emma and Lucas. The idea of using Sarah as the subject of his twisted culinary experiment had been planted in their minds slowly. Over time, Jack had managed to manipulate them into agreeing to participate in his dark fantasy. They had been complicit, though they hadn't fully understood the scope of what was about to unfold. Emma, despite her quiet and reserved nature, had been the first to give in to Jack's suggestions. Her own insecurities and feelings of inadequacy had made her vulnerable to Jack's influence. She had been told that this would be a unique opportunity to be a part of something extraordinary, something that no one else could ever replicate. Jack had presented it as an experience, a way for them to feel closer to each other and to elevate their bond to something transcendent. He had even convinced them that Sarah, too, had agreed to this idea, though the truth was far more sinister. Lucas, ever the charming and persuasive one, had been the last to be fully convinced. He had hesitated, unsure of what to think, but Jack's arguments had ultimately won him over. The promise of being part of something so exclusive, so rare, had been too tempting for him to resist. And so, with each passing day, the friends had grown closer to the reality of what was about to happen. The dinner party that Sarah had hosted was not the innocent gathering it appeared to be. It was the culmination of months of manipulation, planning, and deceit. Jack had orchestrated the entire event with precision, knowing exactly how it would unfold. Sarah had been the perfect target, trusting, generous, and unaware of the horror that awaited her. The meal that Jack had prepared was not just a feast for the senses. It was a grotesque tribute to his own obsession, a dark celebration of a life snuffed out for the sake of his culinary desires. And so, when Sarah had excused herself that night, leaving her friends behind, she had unknowingly sealed her fate. What had begun as a simple dinner gathering had morphed into something far darker, and by the time the others left the table that night, the plans they had made had already taken shape. The horror would not be discovered until weeks later, when the police would uncover the ghastly truth. But for now, the friends would continue their charade, pretending to be concerned about Sarah's disappearance, all the while knowing exactly what had transpired. The town of Brooksville would never be the same again. The darkness within Sarah's circle of friends had been exposed, and the quiet, peaceful town would soon be rocked by the revelation of what had truly happened that night. As the days turned into weeks, the police found themselves growing more desperate. The investigation had reached a dead end, and with each passing day, the hope of finding Sarah alive faded. Her friends Jack, Emma, and Lucas remained steadfast in their public displays of concern, but behind the scenes, the unsettling truth was beginning to take shape. The investigation had already uncovered the evidence of foul play, but the authorities had yet to make the connection that would unravel the entire web of deception. The key to unlocking the mystery lay in the forensic evidence. At the scene in the warehouse, the remains of the body had been thoroughly examined. The nature of the crime was so disturbing that it left even the most experienced detectives shaken. The evidence pointed to a methodical and deliberate act, not a random attack, but rather the culmination of a twisted plan. The fact that parts of the body had been cooked and consumed by the perpetrators made it clear that the crime was far beyond a mere act of violence. It was an act of ritualistic brutality, something that transcended mere murder. The police had found traces of spices and seasoning on the remains, suggesting that the perpetrators had treated the act as one would treat the preparation of a fine dish. It was a chilling detail that made the crime all the more horrific. Whoever had done this had been not only violent but calculated, careful in their actions, and wholly indifferent to the humanity of their victim. The very idea that someone would turn another person into food seemed unfathomable, but the evidence was undeniable. It was a crime so grotesque that it sent shockwaves through the town, and yet the perpetrators walked among the community, their faces a mask of innocence. The more the police dug into the lives of Sarah's friends, the more they began to realize that there were cracks in their stories. Each of them had spoken about Sarah with the same public concern, but the inconsistencies in their statements were starting to surface. The small details they had given, when examined more closely, did not match up with the evidence. They were too calm, too composed for people who had just lost a close friend. Their alibis were solid, but there was something about the way they interacted with the investigation that didn't sit right with the detectives. Jack, in particular, stood out as a figure of interest. His obsession with food was well known among those who had worked with him. As a chef, Jack had always been praised for his skills, his ability to create dishes that seemed to transcend ordinary cooking. But what many didn't know was that Jack's passion for food had grown into an obsession. He had always talked about the art of cooking in almost reverential terms, as if it were something sacred. But in the weeks leading up to Sarah's disappearance, Jack had become increasingly secretive. His friends had noticed that he was spending more time alone, his thoughts often distant and distracted. His culinary creations had become more extravagant, more elaborate. But there was something unsettling about them, something that spoke of a deeper, more disturbing drive. The investigators began to focus more closely on Jack's behavior. They looked into his financial records, his communications, his interactions with his friends. And what they found was troubling. Jack had been planning something for months, even before Sarah's disappearance. He had been researching strange culinary techniques, studying ancient practices, and exploring bizarre ideas about food and consumption. There were notes in his journals that suggested a fascination with taboo subjects, topics that veered into the realm of the macabre. He had been experimenting with unusual ingredients, often without any apparent reason, beyond his own obsession with the idea of creating the ultimate dish. It wasn't just about cooking for him anymore. It was about achieving something that no one else could. Jack was no longer just a chef. He had become a man obsessed with the limits of human appetite and the boundaries of morality. The more the police dug, the more they uncovered about Jack's twisted state of mind. They learned that he had been seeing a therapist for several years, someone who had helped him manage his growing obsession. But there were no records to suggest that Jack had ever spoken about the darker aspects of his desires. His therapy sessions had focused on surface-level issues like stress and work-life balance. But the police suspected that Jack had been hiding his true feelings, keeping his darker impulses buried deep within. The therapist had been unaware of the extent of Jack's obsession, and Jack had been careful to keep it hidden from everyone, even those closest to him. Emma and Lucas, too, had secrets of their own. While they hadn't been as obvious in their obsessions, the police quickly discovered that their lives were not as simple as they had appeared. Emma, who had always been the quiet, reserved one, had been struggling with a deep sense of self-worth. She had always been overshadowed by her more outgoing friends, and it had left her feeling insignificant. But over time, she had become more involved in Jack's plans, drawn into his world by a combination of her own insecurities and Jack's manipulative tactics. Emma had been led to believe that she was part of something extraordinary, something that would elevate her above the others, give her a sense of importance and belonging. Jack had promised her that this would be her moment to shine, to be a part of something no one would ever forget. But the truth was far darker. Emma had been complicit in the crime, seduced by Jack's promises of grandeur and status. In her desperate need for validation, she had turned a blind eye to the consequences of her actions. Lucas, too, had his own demons. He had always been the charming one, the life of the party, the person everyone wanted to be around. But underneath that facade, Lucas was deeply insecure. His need for validation was constant, and he would go to great lengths to prove his worth to others. When Jack presented the idea of the ritual, Lucas had hesitated at first. But Jack's persuasive arguments and the promise of an exclusive experience had been too much for him to resist. Lucas had been convinced that this would be his chance to be a part of something unforgettable. He had been drawn into Jack's vision, seduced by the idea of being involved in something that would make him stand out from the crowd. But Lucas, like Emma, had failed to see the horror in what they were doing until it was too late. As the investigation continued to unfold, the police were able to piece together the timeline of events. They traced the movements of the group on the night of Sarah's disappearance. The night had started innocently enough, with a dinner party hosted by Sarah. But it wasn't just a simple gathering of friends. Jack had been preparing for this night for weeks. He had planned every detail of the evening, carefully orchestrating each step to ensure that everything went according to his twisted vision. When Sarah had excused herself that night, she had unknowingly walked into the trap that had been set for her. It was then that the true horror of what had transpired began to take shape. The investigation uncovered that Sarah had been drugged, her senses dulled by a substance slipped into her drink. She had been incapacitated before the true horror began. Jack, Emma, and Lucas had acted as one, their roles carefully planned in advance. Sarah had been the victim of a brutal, Calculated attack, a premeditated murder driven by Jack's obsession and the others' complicity. When the police finally confronted Jack, Emma, and Lucas, their reactions were not what the authorities had expected. There was no sign of remorse, no visible signs of guilt. They seemed oddly detached, as if they had long ago resigned themselves to the reality of what they had done. The confessions came easily. Jack, in particular, seemed almost relieved to speak the truth, as though the burden of keeping his secret had finally been lifted. He spoke matter-of-factly, recounting the details of the crime with a chilling calmness. Emma and Lucas, too, admitted their involvement, though their words lacked the same coldness. They had been manipulated, yes, but they had also been complicit in the crime. They had chosen to participate, to turn a blind eye to the horror unfolding before them. The truth, when it came, was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. What had started as a simple dinner party had ended in one of the most gruesome crimes the town of Brooksville had ever seen. The friends had taken part in an act of cannibalism, a twisted ritual that left the community reeling in shock and disbelief. The bonds of friendship had been shattered, replaced by a darkness that would forever stain the town's history. As the investigation concluded, the town of Brooksville was left to pick up the pieces. Sarah's death was a brutal reminder of the dangers that can lurk beneath the surface of even the closest relationships. The friends who had once been inseparable had become strangers, bound together by a shared crime that no one could forget. The town would never be the same again. The aftermath of the discovery sent shockwaves through the small town of Brooksville, where secrets had festered beneath the seemingly peaceful surface for years. The arrest of Jack, Emma, and Lucas brought an eerie sense of closure, but it also opened up a new world of unanswered questions. The community was left in a daze, unable to comprehend how something so horrific could occur in their midst. How had the town's most trusted, well-liked individuals, people with normal lives, jobs, and relationships, become capable of such unthinkable cruelty? The tragic end of Sarah, whose body had been subjected to the horrors of cannibalism, left everyone grappling for answers. It wasn't just a murder. It was a statement, a profound betrayal that shook the very foundation of trust within Brooksville. The police had their work cut out for them as they delved deeper into the minds of those responsible. They learned that Jack, Emma, and Lucas had been harboring a dark secret for years, one that no one had seen coming. Their connections were more complex than anyone had ever imagined, and their bond had run far deeper than friendship. As investigators pieced together the events leading up to Sarah's death, they began to understand how Jack had used his charm, his passion for food, and his ability to manipulate those around him to orchestrate the horrific plan. He had started with small suggestions, testing the waters, planting ideas in Emma and Lucas's minds until they were so entwined in his delusions that they had come to see Sarah not as a friend but as a mere object to fulfill Jack's twisted desire for perfection. But Jack wasn't the only one to blame. Emma and Lucas had each been drawn into Jack's web in their own way, their vulnerabilities exploited to serve his dark purposes. Emma's deep-seated need for validation and her desperate desire to be seen as more than just the quiet, overlooked friend had made her an easy target. Jack had presented her with the idea of a perfect meal, an experience that would bond them forever and elevate her to a place of significance she had never known before. It was something Emma couldn't resist. Her internal longing for acceptance, paired with Jack's persuasive words, pushed her into a role she had never imagined she would take on. Though she had hesitated, once she was involved, Emma found herself spiraling into a world where Jack's vision was the only reality that mattered. The crime was a means for her to prove herself, to break free from the confines of her own self-doubt and insecurity. Lucas, on the other hand, had always prided himself on being the life of the party, the person everyone turned to for fun and excitement. Beneath his charm, however, lay a man who craved attention and validation just as much as Emma did. He had always feared being forgotten, being left behind in a world that moved too quickly. Jack's offer of inclusion into something exclusive, something that no one else would ever understand, had been too alluring to refuse. Lucas believed that by participating he would be cementing his place in the group, securing his significance in the eyes of his friends. Jack had skillfully manipulated him, making Lucas believe that this act would elevate him, make him special in a way that nothing else could. It wasn't just a crime, it was a twisted form of bonding, a way for the three of them to reaffirm their sense of power and control. As the investigation into the case progressed, the details of Sarah's death became increasingly disturbing. The warehouse where Sarah's body had been found had been an old, abandoned building that no one in the town had thought to visit for years. It had been a forgotten place, an ideal spot for something dark to unfold away from prying eyes. The police had learned that the building had been used for years by various groups, all of them seeking solitude and secrecy. It was an unremarkable place, tucked away on the outskirts of town, far from the familiar homes and neighborhoods of Brooksville. That made it the perfect location for Jack's twisted culinary experiment. Inside, the investigators found not only the remnants of Sarah's body but evidence that suggested the crime had been premeditated for a long time. Jack had gone to great lengths to prepare the meal, gathering rare spices and exotic ingredients. He had set up the warehouse like a stage, with a makeshift kitchen where everything had been carefully arranged for the purpose of the meal. The bones had been carefully cracked, and the pieces of flesh had been roasted with an unsettling attention to detail. Jack had not just killed Sarah, he had turned her death into a grotesque ritual, something he believed would immortalize him and his friends in a way no one else could understand. The forensics team had been able to piece together what had transpired inside that building. While the remains of Sarah's body were the most shocking aspect of the discovery, the true horror lay in the psychological manipulation that had occurred. There had been a prolonged period of torment before her death, an orchestration of fear, confusion, and helplessness that had made her an unwilling participant in her own demise. The team found evidence that suggested Sarah had been drugged, her movements slowed and her ability to fight back severely compromised. This had been no spontaneous outburst of violence. It had been a carefully planned, executed execution of murder that had been years in the making. The police learned that Sarah had been aware of some of the tensions brewing among her friends before her disappearance. She had noticed small changes in Jack's behavior, the way he had begun to withdraw into himself, obsessed with perfecting his craft. She had heard rumors about his strange culinary experiments and had been uneasy about his growing fixation on extreme forms of cuisine. Sarah had always been a supportive friend, but she had begun to worry about Jack's increasingly obsessive nature. She had tried to talk to him about it, but Jack's charm and persuasion had always kept her from seeing the full picture. He had reassured her, downplaying the severity of his actions, but Sarah had known something was wrong. What she hadn't known was just how far Jack's obsession would take him or how far her friends would go to fulfill his twisted desires. The police discovered that Jack had also been involved in a series of secretive online forums where he had discussed his dark fantasies with strangers who shared his extreme views. He had exchanged ideas with individuals who reveled in shock value culinary art, discussing the notion of using human flesh in a gastronomic sense. Jack had been inspired by these dark online communities, feeding his own delusions of grandeur. He believed that the ultimate meal was not just about flavor, it was about transcending the boundaries of normal human experience, about creating something so rare and so unique that it would leave an indelible mark on the world. The idea of using a human body, someone he knew and trusted, was something he had considered for a long time. And once the seed was planted in his mind, it had only been a matter of time before he manipulated Emma and Lucas into helping him bring his dark vision to life. While the investigation dug deeper into Jack's online activities, they also focused on the interactions among the three friends. The pattern that emerged was one of coercion and psychological manipulation. Emma and Lucas had been influenced by Jack's charisma and shared their own insecurities and doubts, which Jack had used to exploit them. They had been complicit, yes, but their involvement was not born out of pure malice. They had been led down a dark path by Jack's promises of belonging, of being part of something extraordinary. They had been blind to the true nature of what they were involved in, their minds clouded by their own desires for acceptance and significance. The police eventually uncovered that after Sarah had been killed, the group had gone to great lengths to cover up the crime. They had cleaned the warehouse, discarded any evidence that could implicate them, and kept up the facade of concern for Sarah's disappearance. They continued to act as though they had no knowledge of what had happened to her, even as they knew the truth. The horror of their actions weighed on them, but it wasn't guilt that drove them, it was fear. They feared the repercussions, the consequences of what they had done, and the realization that they would be forever haunted by their involvement in such a monstrous crime. As the trial loomed closer, the town of Brooksville was left to pick up the pieces. The once thriving community was now a shadow of its former self, its residents shaken to the core by the revelations. Sarah's family was devastated by the loss of their beloved daughter, their grief compounded by the horror of what had happened to her. The trial of Jack, Emma, and Lucas became a media spectacle, with reporters and onlookers flocking to the small town to catch a glimpse of the people responsible for such a heinous crime. The courtroom became the stage for a battle of words as the defense and prosecution presented their cases, but no amount of legal wrangling could change the fact that the crime had been committed, and the consequences would be far-reaching. In the end, the conviction of the three friends brought a sense of justice to the community, but it did little to heal the wounds that had been inflicted. Sarah's life had been brutally cut short, and the friendship that once bound the three perpetrators together had been shattered forever. Brooksville would never be the same, and neither would the people who had once lived there in peace. As the story of Sarah's death came to a close, the town was left to wonder how something so monstrous could have taken root in such a seemingly ordinary place. The trial of Jack, Emma, and Lucas gripped the town of Brooksville and the nation alike, shining an unrelenting light on a crime so grotesque it seemed impossible to comprehend. As the court proceedings began, the public was inundated with details that painted a chilling picture of betrayal and obsession. Sarah's family sat quietly in the courtroom, their grief compounded by the relentless scrutiny of the media and the horrifying revelations that continued to surface. Their daughter had been not only murdered but subjected to an act of unspeakable desecration, her body consumed in a twisted imitation of art. The evidence against the three was overwhelming. Forensic reports, digital correspondence, and confessions painted a picture of cold, calculated premeditation. Jack's meticulous planning had turned Sarah's death into a macabre performance. His obsession with culinary perfection, warped into something monstrous, drove the entire operation. Jack's defense portrayed him as an artist consumed by his vision, but the prosecution was unyielding in portraying him as a manipulative individual who exploited his friend's vulnerabilities to execute his horrific plan. Emma's role in the crime was equally scrutinized. Her insecurities and need for validation had made her susceptible to Jack's manipulations. She had seen the crime as a way to escape her own shadow and prove her worth, but that escape had come at an unimaginable cost. Lucas, driven by his fear of insignificance and desperate need for acceptance, had also fallen under Jack's influence. Together, the trio had become complicit in an act that forever changed not only their lives but the fabric of their community. During the trial, the courtroom was a theater of pain and betrayal. Prosecutors detailed how Jack had convinced Emma and Lucas to participate, manipulating their fears and desires until they saw Sarah not as a friend but as a tool in his deranged pursuit of culinary immortality. Witnesses testified about Sarah's growing unease with Jack in the weeks leading up to her death, noting his increasingly erratic behavior and obsession with creating something unforgettable. However, no one could have foreseen the extent of his plans or the devastating role Emma and Lucas would play. As each defendant took the stand, their attempts to explain their actions only deepened the sense of horror. Jack remained defiant, insisting his actions were misunderstood, the result of artistic passion taken to extremes. Emma wept as she described how she had been drawn into Jack's world, blinded by a need to belong. Lucas tried to deflect blame, claiming he had been pressured into participating, but the evidence revealed a chilling level of cooperation. None of their testimonies could erase the reality of what had been done to Sarah. The jury deliberated for only a short time, delivering a unanimous guilty verdict. Jack, Emma, and Lucas were sentenced to life in prison without parole, their fates sealed as the perpetrators of a crime that would haunt Brooksville forever. The courtroom erupted in quiet sobs and murmurs as the verdict was read. Justice had been served, but it brought little solace to Sarah's grieving family, or to the community left to grapple with the enormity of what had transpired. In the aftermath, Brooksville struggled to heal. The idyllic town became synonymous with the crime, its name forever tied to the brutal betrayal that had taken place within its borders. Sarah's family retreated from public life, seeking solace in memories of their daughter's vibrant spirit. They established a foundation in her honor, aimed at preventing future tragedies and fostering mental health awareness in small communities like theirs. For Jack, Emma, and Lucas, the walls of their prison cells became their new reality. Each faced the unbearable weight of their actions, haunted by the knowledge that they had not only destroyed a life but had also forfeited their own humanity. Jack's obsession, Emma's insecurities, and Lucas's need for validation had led them to a dark place from which there was no return. The town tried to move forward, but the scars remained. Parents held their children closer, friends looked at one another with suspicion, and the once vibrant streets carried an air of unease. Brooksville had been irrevocably changed by the actions of three people who had once been part of its fabric. Though the trial concluded and the sentences were handed down, the question lingered: how could seemingly ordinary people commit such an extraordinary act of cruelty? That question, unanswerable and haunting, would echo in the hearts of those left behind, a grim reminder of the fragile boundary between trust and betrayal. Sarah's story became a cautionary tale, a tragic reminder of how far people can fall when they lose sight of their humanity. Her name was etched into the history of Brooksville, not as a victim, but as a symbol of the life that was taken too soon, and the darkness that lay hidden in those she called friends. And so, the chilling story of Sarah's tragic fate comes to a close, a life taken, not by strangers, but by those she trusted the most. The horror of betrayal, deception, and a hunger that went far beyond the physical, leaving us questioning how deep the darkness can run within the human heart. This case serves as a haunting reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and sometimes, the people closest to us are capable of unspeakable acts. But even in the face of unimaginable tragedy, justice was served, though the scars of this crime will forever linger. Thank you for joining us today on Mystery Minds. If you were disturbed by this story, you're not alone. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more gripping true crime cases as we continue to uncover the most shocking and mysterious stories from the dark corners of our world. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and remember, the truth is often stranger and more horrifying than fiction.